The question of the day is, how did the food you ate as a child differ from what's common today? Our food was more local, came from local sources. We knew the source of our food more than we do today. For the most part, most of our food we grew ourselves. Nearly everyone in our community had a garden. Even though we lived in the city, there were people who would designate a part of their backyard as their garden. So we grew a lot of the vegetables that we ate came from our own backyard. My mother would say, go out there and bring me a mess of string beans. Now, I don't know how much a mess is, but I figured it must be enough to serve everybody in our family. So she would say, get a mess of string beans, get a mess of collard greens. And I don't know where she got that word mess from, but we were always instructed to bring a mess of whatever it is we were bringing. But I digress. So we knew even at our A&P store, we shopped at a grocery store called A&P. And even then, when we were buying meats and different things in the store, we knew that they were coming from local farmers in North Carolina. And we all had relatives that lived in the country. We had relatives that lived in the country. That's the rural area, but we referred to it as the country. And we would often get meats from our relatives who had hogs and cows and had farms in these rural areas. My grandmother had a yard full of chickens. So whenever we needed chicken or we were down there and we wanted chicken, she'd just go in her backyard, get a chicken, wring his neck, put it in some boiling water, pull the feathers off, and we would have chicken to eat. Secondly, people took real pride in making their own food, and they enjoyed making the food from scratch. Now, by scratch, that means from the very beginning. No one helped you along the way to make this particular dish. For example, today, if you want apple pie, you can go to the store and you can buy a ready-made pie crust. Then you can walk down the aisles and you can find a can or a jar that says apple pie filling. So then you can get the apple pie filling. You can put the apple pie filling into the crust that was ready made, and then you shake it, make it a little even, put some fancy stuff on the top, put it in the oven, and now you got an apple pie. But when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, that was a no-no. If you're going to make apple pie, you got to get fresh apples. And then you got to chop them. And then you got to add just the right spices and ingredients to make the apple pie taste just the way you want it to taste. And then you're going to get the flour and you're going to make the crust. And you're going to make everything yourself. So it was in those days, in the 50s and 60s, it was about people really getting into their cooking and feeling it and wanting it to be a part of them and them to be a part of it. They wanted to touch their food. They wanted to know every ingredient that was in it. And they took such pride and they created things with such love, you know. So today, I don't really see that pride in making everything from scratch the way we did in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, there's a story that will emphasize how important this was to make everything from scratch. And this has to do with the Betty Crocker mixes. Now, I would be almost a teenager before my mother would invest in any of those mixes. But I know that the Betty Crocker mixes came on the scene in 1947. But the wives, the people who made the dinners, who cooked the food, who baked in the home, they didn't want to touch it. So Betty Crocker had a kind of disaster on their hands because they'd made this mix and nobody wanted to buy it. Now, the reason no one wanted to buy it wasn't because it didn't taste good. I understand that it did. They didn't want to buy it because all you had to do was add water. And the grandmothers and the mothers and the caregivers and the people who were doing the cooking and the baking in the homes, they said, just add water. I don't want that. That's too easy. How could I feel good about serving this to my family? And so it took, Betty Crocker had to come back to the drawing board, and then they came back, revamped it. Now, I don't know whether they really changed anything or not, but when the new mix came out, it was like, oh, don't just add water. You need to add water. You need to add an egg. You need to add some oil. And the people who were doing the cooking and baking accepted that better because it meant they had to actually work with it a little bit more. And so that's one of the big differences that I see, is that today we don't know what's in our food. We're not really sure where it came from. There are ingredients that we can't pronounce up and down the labels. And in the 50s and 60s, our food was cleaner because we took pride in making sure we knew the source and making sure that we knew every little ingredient that was in our food. The other thing I see different with the food today and the food of yesterday is mainly in how it is consumed and how it is delivered. Here in New York, sometimes I can hardly walk down my own block because there's so many bikes and scooters on the sidewalk making deliveries to so many of the homes up and down the block. Deliveries, eating out, picking up food is a big thing that didn't exist when I was growing up. Well, we didn't have all these fast food places. McDonald's didn't come around until the 50s, and it was the first fast food place that we had in North Carolina. So we were not used to eating out. We were not used to ordering out. We were used to, like I said, getting the food from the grocery store or from our own yards, cooking it ourselves, and making sure there was at least one meal during the day that was served at the table with everybody gathered around the table. And if there was somebody that couldn't be at that table, then we'd save them a plate back and we'd warm it up. But I believe that everybody at that time in the 1950s and 1960s were treating restaurants a little differently than the way they're treated today. We were part of Jim Crow. We weren't able to go to that many restaurants anyway. But I think even people who could go to restaurants. It wasn't like an everyday thing. It was a special occasion. It was a here and now thing. But not like today, where it seems like if we had the money, we would just eat at restaurants all the time, every day. So these are the differences that I see in how the food was in the 1950s and the 1960s compared to the way that the food is today here in 2024. The first thing is that we knew the source of our food. We took pride in making our food, and we tried to make sure that we ate at home more, and we gathered around the table as a family.